Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about capitalism and what that is, and socialism and what that is, and revolution and why we need that, and of course what that is as well. And I hope to, this is basically just like an introductory level thing, so you don't really need to have any prior knowledge of any of those things to really kind of understand it. And anyways, if you guys have any questions along the way, feel free to stop me. And yeah, so capitalism, basically, most basically is a system in which there are two classes that exist. One is the bourgeoisie, which just is a fancy word that means the owning class. They're the people that own the means of production. The means of production are anything that help you produce commodities. So that's land or factories or whatever. And then the other class is the proletariat, and that's the working class. These people don't own anything except for their own labor power. That's the only thing they're able to sell, right? So they have to work, so the proletariat has to be employed by the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, they own, control, and enjoy the products of society, while meanwhile the proletariat create all of the products of society, but they do not control them, enjoy them, or own them, at least not to the extent that the bourgeoisie does. Now, capitalism probably needs to be contrasted with the system that came before that, which was feudalism. Under feudalism, you basically, there were serfs, peasants, these were farmers that were tied to land, and, and that land was owned by a lord, basically, and the lord, took all their surplus from them, and that was, of course, replaced by capitalism, but it was replaced because a new mode of production was brought in. Basically, that meant that that new inventions such as steam power were able to create a new way of producing things. So, for instance, steam engines, the most efficient way to make use of those is in large factories. And so in large factories, it's more efficient to have more people working in those. So that displaced both feudal, the necessary peasants, as well as handicraftsmen, right? So handicraftsmen, these are people that would make an entire product just on their own, at their own homes. Whereas when, so when large-scale production comes in, it's much more efficient than handicraftsmen, right? And so all the handicraftsmen that were employed, basically self-employed, they all weren't able to compete on that level, and so they got pushed out of business. And so the only place for them to go was to then go and work in the factories. And as a matter of fact, one of the big movements in England, they were called, when this was happening, were called the Luddites. And the Luddites basically were really, they were basically unemployed handicraftsmen. Well, not unemployed, they were then employed by the bourgeoisie in the factories. But, of course, their whole way of life was changed. They were sick of being exploited by the capitalists and things like that. So they lashed out, and they lashed out specifically on the new mode of production, on the factories, on the steam engines, on the industrial apparatus itself. And yeah, this large-scale production, overproducing and outcompeting small-scale production, this happens kind of every time a new market comes out, like when there's small businesses that try to occupy that market for a while, and then eventually, large businesses come in and, basically put them out of business. And you can see this even today, like in instances such as like when Walmart moves into a community. Basically, all the people that were selling products aren't able to compete because they don't have the large infrastructure that Walmart has that enables them to sell things at such a low price. And so all those people become all the people that were working there or owned those companies become unemployed, and of course that's who supplies the new employees for the Walmart or whatever. All right. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what capitalist exploitation looks like. And there's a couple concepts we need to talk about. One is use value. Now, use value, basically that's the value of a commodity that you get out of using it. So, like the use value of a car would be driving, right? Its use value is in driving, right? The use value of an egg salad sandwich, unless you're vegan, of course, is in the eating of the egg salad sandwich. This is the value that exists completely independently of the market. And the next form of value is exchange value. Now, exchange value exists within the market. Right? This is the value of any one of these things relative to all other objects in the economy. So a used car equals the value of, say, a fraction of a house, a lot of dinners, or a couple $1,000s. Once again, that exists within the market. And then, of course, we have labor. Okay? Labor is basically a person's life activity, right? It's a manifestation of your life, your time. So, you know, the thing that makes a person a carpenter, is that he is engaged in carpentry. It's him carving wood. But under capitalism, that becomes a commodity. But it's a unique commodity because it produces new commodities, right? So it can make a fallow field, it can make that into a farm, it can make steel into a building, and it can make wood into a chair. No other commodities can do this. And then there are wages. Okay? Wages, while they can vary with the market, the trend is for them to level down for the costs necessary for keeping the worker alive, keep him working and capable of reproducing to create more workers. This is basically just what the capitalist agrees to pay the worker. And this is essentially the exchange value of your labor. So the exchange value of your labor equals your wages. The worker gets a fixed sum regardless of what the capitalist makes off his labor power. So you work for a certain amount of time, and you get a certain pre-established fee, regardless of how much the capitalist makes off of the time you worked. Okay, and then we need to talk about surplus value. Now, surplus value is a very interesting thing because when a capitalist, so he has the cost of the raw materials and then he has the cost of your labor power, which he pays you for. But then somehow, when he sells the products, he sells it for more than he paid for both the raw materials and what he paid for the exchange value of your labor. And so this is where exploitation comes in, right? So we have, let's see. So basically in a workday, right? Let's say this is a workday, right? So A to B, this represents the time that you need to work in order to make the exchange value of your labor, how much time, how many products you need to make in order to make up that cost, right? So that is a certain amount of time. So let's say you work 8 hours a day, you get paid $70 for that time, but you make $70 worth of products in 4 hours. But of course you work for the whole 8, right? So this whole time, this is surplus labor that you are giving to your employer. And of course, this is where he derives surplus value from. So essentially, when you're working, remember that you work for those 4 hours. Remember, for those next 4 hours, that's something that you're giving to your boss for free. Of course, this is where exploitation comes from. And of course, this is where he generates capital, which he then is able to take and use to produce more products. And this value, when accumulated, is called capital. And the more capital owned by the ruling class, the poorer and more powerless is the working class. Your relative wages, which is basically how much you make in relation to other people, that's going to go down the more they make because they will be, of course, richer than you. In addition to that, of course, they can have more political power and all those things, whereas your place becomes more and more marginalized. So the harder your work and the more money you make for your boss, the more powerless and the more poor you actually become in society. Now, according to classical economists, who were the proponents of capitalism when it was in its birth stages, they had an idea about how the bourgeoisie, the owning class, came to be, and it went a little bit something like this. There were people who were motivated, and there were people that were lazy. The people that were motivated went out and worked really hard, and they were able to, buy the factories, and of course the people that didn't work very hard became their employees. Now, this is really absurd, and it actually doesn't match up with history at all. One of the things that we need to talk about here is something called enclosures, or primitive accumulation. This is where property actually comes from. And it's also where the proletariat comes from. And it also shows the necessity, a lot of classical economists will also say, like, oh, capitalism is a force opposed to the state. But that's not the case. Capitalism depends on the state, and is always dependent on the state in order for it to function. So, for instance, we have in the 18th and 19th century the enclosures of English farmland. Basically, you have 11,000 square miles that used to be held in common by people who would work it together. But that didn't work for capitalist property. You needed to have it owned by an individual. And so there were various acts that were put into place, called the Enclosure Acts, incidentally, that basically allowed one person to come in and then take ownership of these previously commonly held fields. And George Orwell actually wrote about this, and he said, "Stop to consider how the so-called owners of the land got hold of it. They simply seized it by force, afterwards hiring lawyers to provide them with title deeds. In the case of the enclosure of the common lands, which was going on from about 1600 to 1850, the land grabbers did not even have the excuse of being foreign conquerors. They were quite frankly taking the heritage of their own countrymen upon no sort of pretext except that they had the power to do so." So that's one example of how property came to be concentrated in the hands of the ruling class. Another example, a little bit closer to home, and one that a group of people that didn't manage to avoid Orwell's example of being conquered by foreigners, are the Native Americans. And this was accomplished in a couple different ways. One, of course, was conquest, and this conquest was accomplished by means of the state. The state militarily went out and massacred millions of Native Americans in order to steal their land. And of course, initially this land was gobbled up by homesteaders, small-scale homesteaders, but of course they weren't able to afford this land for a long time, and eventually it was gobbled up by corporations and large landholders and things like that. And then this was also accomplished legally through things like the General Allotment Act. So after the Native Americans were put on reservations, they still held their land in common. But through the General Allotment Act, which is also called the Dawes Act, put into place in 1891, they divided tribally held lands into individually owned parcels and opened up surplus lands to settlement and development by non-Indians. So in these individually held parcels, it was much easier for large business owners to come in and, of course, purchase these small parcels of land, gradually taking the reservation land away piece by piece. And of course, since Native Americans lived in extremely impoverished conditions, they would take whatever cash they could get from it, so it was acquired very cheaply. And yet another example is with the passage, which is more recent, is the passage of NAFTA. With the passage of NAFTA, once again, you have a similar situation in Mexico, where farmers in Mexico, through their constitution, were guaranteed the right to hold their communally worked lands in perpetuity. But NAFTA was a free trade agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement, signed between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, forced the Mexican government to rewrite their constitution so that they would get rid of those provisions which protected landowners. Then, as part of NAFTA, the United States was able to flood the Mexican market with cheap subsidized grain, which of course the Mexican farmers couldn't afford to compete with. And so you see them not able to compete, and of course, they are going to become more and more impoverished because of this, and then they're going to have to sell their land. And that's the way land was accumulated in Mexico very recently, and it actually displaced at least 2 million farmers. And so when we hear about illegal immigration and things, we know that it's U.S. government policy right? U.S. businesses acting in tandem with the U.S. state that has caused this problem. Of course, the same process is going on worldwide in every corner of the world. And you know, when all these people become displaced from their land that they've held for generations, they end up becoming the new working class, moving in large numbers into the cities, and usually moving into large slums. Slum populations have skyrocketed in recent years. The number of people living in slums worldwide has increased by 55 million in the last 10 years. 55 million. Another example of this kind of same idea of enclosure is the privatization of Russia, which started back in 1991, 92. And with privatization of Russia, like when socialism was collapsing in Russia, people, of course, democratically speaking, the people, polls were taken at that time, and people said that what they would prefer is to have full employment still guaranteed by their government, and they would like to have state property distributed to workers' co-ops. That's what polls said. The majority of Russian workers wanted that. However, the Russian government international businesses did not want that. And so they made use of Boris Yeltsin, who took upon himself dictatorial powers in order to have state assets auctioned off to corporations for very, very low prices, and have price controls lifted, and of course unemployment in Russia has skyrocketed, and it's had horrendous effects for the people of Russia, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit later in my lecture. Another aspect of capitalism is overproduction and capitalist crises. So basically, if in capitalism, when capitalism is doing really well and they're producing all of these commodities, a lot of times they have too much of a commodity and it forces the price of these things down, so much so that it's not even profitable for corporations to sell them or for large businesses to sell them. And so in things like the Great Depression, when you have at least 1 million people starving here in the United States, you have absurd things happening like the burning of grain. So for one thing, grain was just sitting around in warehouses because it was too expensive to ship it anywhere to have people buy it, but also they literally burned it. While people were starving to death in capitalism, that's how you solve the problem. You burn the commodity that people so desperately need. And currently, right now, a similar situation is happening with the housing crisis, right? The housing bubble crisis, rather. So we have all these houses sitting empty. So instead of having people move into these houses, what banks are actually doing is they're bulldozing the houses. Another way that the capitalists deal with these overproduction crises is by opening up new markets. And one excellent way to do this is by invading another country to open up their previously closed markets. So we can see this example in Iraq, which had a fairly nationalist economy, right? Wasn't so friendly to foreign investment and things like that. And so we invade them, we open up their economy, we once again sell off their state assets for very little money. And as Naomi Klein says, the U.S. has no intention of actually getting out of Iraq. It wants troops to remain, and it wants Bechtel, MCI, and Halliburton to stay behind and run the water system, the phones, and the oil fields. And of course, this kind of intervention happens extremely regularly, and it has disastrous consequences. For instance, and of course, not just to open up markets, but to prevent markets from being closed. It does this all the time. It did it in North Korea, and 2 million people died there. It did it in Vietnam, where 3 million people were killed. It did it in Laos and Cambodia, where 500,000 people were killed by bombing. It did it in Angola, where 1.5 million people were killed as a result. Mozambique, 1 million. Afghanistan, this just being in the first Afghanistan conflict, 500,000. Indonesia, 200,000. East Timor, 200,000. Nicaragua, 100,000. Guatemala, 100,000. El Salvador, 60,000. Argentina, 30,000. Taiwan, 35,000. And Chile, 20,000. This all just happened within the last 50 or 60 years, every single one of these examples. And it goes back in time to the beginning of the United States, actually. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is revolution. So essentially, revolution is the overthrowing of one class by another class. So revolution is not a war that's fought between two factions of the same class. It's not like in Nazi Germany where you had the Nazis take over on behalf of the capitalists for the enforcement of capitalist interests by getting rid of the organized left. That's not a revolution. A revolution would include things like the French Revolution, where you have the emerging capitalist class, fighting against the aristocracy and the monarchy so that they could then become the ruling class of society. That's what a revolution is. And what's important about that today is that what we'd like is to solve these contradictions is to have the proletariat, the working class, rise up and take control of society, thereby getting rid of the class above it and having those people become working class like everybody else and have to do their fair share. And of course, as we've just looked into, the state exists for the suppression of one class by another. Laws, they have to exist to create new markets, defend property, and ensure regular economic function. The state exists to protect the capitalist system. But the idea would be in a socialist system to get rid of that state and replace it with something else. William Paul writes in his book, The State, Its Origins and Function, the political state throughout history has meant the government of men by the ruling classes. The Republic of Socialism will be the government of industry administered on behalf of the whole community. The former meant the economic and political subjection of the many, and the latter will mean the economic freedom of all. It will therefore be a true democracy. So there's two big trends of thought within this milieu of anti-capitalism. One's the anarchist line of thought, and one's like the communist line of thought, or more particularly the Leninist view, where they believe that, so the anarchist view is that a state is not necessary after we've risen up and overthrown capitalists, that we won't need a state, and that we'll just organize ourselves in non-hierarchical structures, usually organized around things like labor unions. The Leninist view is that the workers will make use of a state, but it won't be the capitalist state. They will demolish the capitalist state, and they will create a new state which they feel will better represent the the aspirations of workers. And of course, the quote illustrating that by Marx is, "The working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. It has to destroy it. It has to smash it." So, an example of this, probably one of the first working class revolutions to ever occur, was the Paris Commune. And the Paris Commune happened in the 1860s. Basically, workers in Paris took advantage of kind of a state of chaos after the French had just barely lost a war with the Prussians, and the working class of Paris basically rose up and created their own political structures and assumed control of the city. It was crushed after a few months by the French army. But Marx says about the Commune, I'm going to quote him at length here, "The Commune was formed of the municipal councillors, chosen by universal suffrage in the various wards of the town, responsible and revocable at any time. The majority of its members were naturally working men, or acknowledged representatives of the working class. The police, which until then had been the instrument of government, was at once stripped of its political attributes and turned into the responsible and at times revocable agent of the Commune. So were the officials of all other branches of the administration. From the members of the Commune downwards, the public service had to be done at workmen's wages. The privileges and the representation allowances of the high dignitaries of state disappeared along with the high dignitaries themselves. Having once got rid of the standing army and the police, the instruments of physical force of the old government, the Commune proceeded at once to break the instrument of spiritual suppression, the power of the priests. The judicial functionaries that lost that sham independence. They were thenceforward to be elective, responsible, and revocable." So once again, the idea of all your representatives being subject to immediate recall if, of course, the working class does not feel like they're representing their interests, in this way preventing there from being a class that arises of bureaucrats above you. Another aspect of revolution is that it liberates people from old oppressive traditions. One place you can see this is in places like China. Before the revolution, essentially, women were forced into arranged marriages, spousal abuse was legal, foot binding, was common, and I'm sure everybody knows what foot binding is, but basically, as little girls were expected to, women were expected to shuffle around and, be servants to their husbands. And one good way of doing this, so they couldn't be walking around doing all this work and be more ladylike, is that they would take their feet, and they would fold their toes under, and then they would wrap a bandage around it. And of course that's extremely excruciating, and then of course you would tighten this periodically until your feet just became these little nubs that were extremely painful and extremely hard to walk on. And of course, divorce was also extremely difficult in pre-revolutionary China. Of course, once the Chinese Revolution occurred, it attacked these brutal and horrible oppressive traditions, and gave women far more freedom, far more rights, and better standing within society. Another aspect of revolution that's important is the end to imperialism. Right? That's, of course, imperialism we talked about earlier, which is where a country needs to open up new markets, and so they go and they invade other countries, and that's how they accumulate more property, keep these other markets open, and things like that. So revolution, at least here in the United States, would mean the end of imperial interventions abroad. But it also means a couple other things. In the USSR, after their revolution, and at least in the first couple decades of the revolution, they had a policy called, I'm actually not going to try to pronounce the Russian word here, but it just means indigenization. And that means that since they were taking over this country that was previously the Russian Empire, and the Russian Empire, of course, got that name by going out and conquering all the nationalities that existed around it. And of course, being socialists, the new Russian government did not feel like it was okay to just prop their state up using the stolen territories of these other nationalities. And so what they did is that they put in this policy of indigenization, which encouraged these people to speak their own language. They had people were then, instead of the oppressive culture of the Russians being put on them, where they had to speak the Russian language, and adhere to Russian customs, they were instead taught their own language, taught their own culture, taught their own history, and were also encouraged to take part in their own governance, self-governance, self-determination for these nations. I think that this policy also has implications here in the United States. Right? We also are a country that's based on the stealing of land from other nationalities, or stealing of labor, or what have you. So there are various nations that exist here within the boundaries of the United States that also are deserving of self-determination, just as these nations in the USSR were. You have Puerto Ricans, you have Native Americans, you have Hawaiians, you have Chicanos. You even have, say African Americans, who are the majority of the population in certain areas, and of course most of them don't too much appreciate being subject to the governance of a bunch of racist people that live alongside them. They don't appreciate, having to be harassed by white policemen that drive by every day. They would like to have their own people representing them, their own people governing them. This is one of the major platforms of the Black Panther Party back in the 70s. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what socialism means in the real world. I'm going to be a little bit less theoretical with this, and I'm going to talk about a couple examples. Primarily, I'm going to talk about Russia and Cuba. Now, of course, to say that socialism created gains in either of these countries does not mean that you have to say that these are an ideal that we should all look up to and we should follow everything that they've done. Of course, we can disagree with different policies about all these things, but the power of a socialist economy is demonstrable and it's undeniable. So I'm just going to kind of go through on some statistics here. So in Russia, First, in 1966, a leading US medical journal wrote, and I should preface this, Russia was basically behind, before the revolution, was behind every other country in Europe. They were the least industrialized, they were backward, they still had a monarch, they were behind everybody else as far as being able to take care of their own people. And then the revolution happened, and that happened in 1917. So once again, in 1966, a leading US medical journal wrote that, quote, life expectancy doubling in the last 50 years. At present time, the Soviet Union graduates annually about as many physicians as there were in the whole Russian Empire before the First World War. Of all the physicians in the world today, more than 1 in 5 is Soviet, while only 1 person in 14 in the world today is a Soviet citizen. In addition, literacy rates before 1917 hardly reached 40%, much less in rural areas, and lower still among women. By the fall of the Soviet Union, literacy rates were higher than in the West. In 1938, the 21 years of Soviet rule had brought about a 50% reduction in the child mortality rate. The height of the average Soviet child in 1938 was 1¼ inches greater than the average child in Tsarist Russia. The weight of the average Soviet child was 11½ pounds greater in 1937 than in 1925. The chest expansion of the average Soviet child in 1938 was roughly 1 inch greater than the average child in Tsarist Russia. Incidence of tuberculosis decreased 83% under Soviet rule up to 1938 and continued to decrease. Cases of syphilis decreased 90% by 1938 and continued to decrease. The death rate in 1937 in the USSR was 40% below the death rate in Russia in 1913. The USSR's life expectancy was consistently well above the world average. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, however, it plummeted significantly. Once socialism collapsed, it went down drastically. Between 1988, which was immediately before socialism collapsed, and 1994, which was immediately after, 2 years after, Russia's life expectancy had dropped by a full 5 years, dropping below the world average for the first time since the gains of socialism were made. Russia's life expectancy today, 20 years after the fall of socialism, has still not managed to regain its pre-collapse levels. In 1993, a UNICEF inquiry estimated that 500,000 extra deaths a year result from the neoliberal reforms in Russia. Russia's social policy chief estimated that 25% of the population has fallen below subsistence levels, while the new rulers, the capitalists and various other people, have gained enormous wealth. And of course, since the collapse of socialism, Russia's suicide rate has doubled since 1990. It was 39.7% per 100. It is now, which is twice the world average. Cuba. Cuba is another example that we can draw inspiration from. For instance, primary education completion rate in Cuba is better than the U.S. Whereas before the Cuban Revolution, the U.S. was almost double. The Cuban infant mortality rate is better than the United States, and is the lowest in the entire Western Hemisphere. In Cuba, child malnutrition in the year 2000 was just 3.4. This, considering this was a period in which they were having massive food shortages because their major trade partner had collapsed and they were going through what was called a special period. But they still had a very low child malnutrition rate of 3.4. You can contrast this with a capitalist country just right across the water from them, Haiti, who of course is not socialist. And at that time, Haiti was actually having their child malnutrition at an all-time low, like the lowest it's ever been, and even since then it's a lot higher than it was. And their child malnutrition rate was 13.4. Once again, Cuba's was 3.4, Haiti's was 13.4. In Cuba, life expectancy in 1960, which was just a year after the revolution, before a lot of the gains had been made, was 63.9. That's 6 full years behind the U.S. at that time. Today, despite a massive trade embargo against Cuba, Cuba has a better life expectancy than the United States.
Anyways, and also in Nicaragua, for instance, when they had their short-lived revolution that was quickly overthrown by U.S. guerrilla warfare against their country, they had an extremely low literacy rate, and just in the short amount of time that they were in power, managed to raise it almost to 100%. These are the gains of socialism, and of course, I believe that they are absolutely necessary to get rid of the evils that capitalism is currently visiting upon our society. And that's it.